So welcome, Stuart Sadler. How are you?
I'm really well, thank you. Thanks for having me on. Yeah, how are you doing?
Yeah, very well. No, you're welcome. I've been pestering you to come on. I'm like, come on, have a chat with Stuart, and we spoke briefly about my group and what my goal is for my group to help my fellow painters and decorators, and mental well-being is very, very high on the agenda. And
Mm.
I've started to do these talks, which I'm filtering into the group and looking at covering all different areas because we're not just painters, we're human beings and we struggle. We have struggles like everybody else. So, just to give you a background, Stuart is, I'm going to check my notes, a chartered clinical psychologist, and you're in Newcastle, right?
Yeah, Newcastle upon Tyne. You do get messages sometimes thinking we're in Newcastle down south and even Australia. There's a Newcastle over in Australia, but definitely Newcastle upon Tyne, northeast of England.
Yeah, and when we spoke before, I said I love Newcastle. We know we've got family up in
Yeah.
Newcastle, but it is always cold up there, isn't it?
It is. It is. We had a lot of snow yesterday.
Mm,
Actually, got really thick with it. It's actually pretty clear today.
yeah,
It's kind of like mild northeast weather.
yeah, definitely. And do you want to just briefly tell me about your sort of practice? Yeah, I found it very interesting what you do.
Yeah, absolutely. So, as you said, I'm a clinical psychologist, and what that means is that I work with people who are having trouble with depression, anxiety. My specialist area is sleep disorders as well, and I run a service in Newcastle called Newcastle Psychologists and Counselling, where we offer a team of specialist counsellors and psychotherapists and psychologists who all specialize in different problems. So we have people who only work with addictions, people who only work with trauma, people who see children, families, couples. And really, the model of our service is we're a team of about 16 therapists who each of us specialize in a certain area of counseling or therapy so that we can help people who come to us with those difficulties better than someone who kind of works in a more general way.
Yeah,
So, for example, if anyone out there is having trouble with depression, anxiety, or sleep, chances are that they would end up coming through to me and seeing
mhm,
me. If they were having trouble with something else, with if difficulties with bereavement, they would end up seeing our bereavement counsellor and so on.
yeah. I think that's a brilliant service, and obviously it's in person, but do you do it online as well?
Absolutely, yeah. We've got a really strong online service. We actually did a lot of online work before COVID, even
Yeah, of course.
because I mean, certainly sleep therapy. There's not many people who work or are experienced or skilled in working with sleep or qualified. I've done a lot of training. I've got some qualifications in sleep medicine. So certainly I mean, I was working quite a lot online even before COVID started.
Yeah, yeah, and it's quite a nice way to work, isn't it? When I was, seeing, I said to my group, I qualified as a cognitive hypnotherapist, and all mine was online. And
Mm.
people can be dubious about it, but it's just as effective, isn't it, to work online?
Yeah, it's interesting. The research that came out of COVID, it actually showed that online works better than face to face. And
Mm,
when they did the analysis and spoke to the clients, it was because with it being online, um, people felt more able and less inhibited talking
mm,
about the problems because they weren't in the same room.
definitely.
So people actually felt more comfortable and therefore maybe got more benefit from it.
Yeah.
So that's a nice little bit of finding that came out of a really difficult time, I think.
Yeah, definitely. And like I say, Stuart, I know you're really busy and you run a really busy practice. So I really do appreciate you coming on. Um, and yeah, we're going to be talking a bit about sleep. And I put a poll into my group and sent you some screenshots. And people were quite active in talking about it. And it's got to be one of the most common problems, hasn't it? Sleep in various forms.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, between 18 and 50% of people have trouble with insomnia or they sleep in some way. And I mean, it's 2023, you can't avoid stress. Stress is part of life now and has a massive impact. We tend to really undersell the importance of sleep, but it impacts on everything, our physical health, our mental health, our day-to-day abilities, even our relationships. It's huge and doesn't really get as much focus as really it should.
Yeah. And in particular as well, not just in particular, but specifically for my group being painters and decorators, most are self-employed, I would say. So it's not just you're not just putting your shift in, it's pretty much 24/7, I would say. You kind of, looking at jobs after work, you're pricing, you're quoting, you're getting customer calls at night.
Mm.
It's feast or famine there can be sometimes in terms of work. So it's worries and anxieties and stuff. So yeah, where do we start with it all? Yeah, I guess it's we could talk for probably 2 days solid about how to help my painters. But where do you reckon we should start?
Yeah, well, I mean, it sounds tough. I don't know anything about painting and decorating, so just hearing what you described there, it sounds like, there's a lot of stress. I mean, I think like most people, to me, if you hire a painter and decorator, they come, they paint, and then they leave, and you don't really kind of think about a lot of that other background stuff that you described.
Mm,
But it kind of sounds as though there's a lot going on there. And I can imagine that, people do experience stress, people do experience a lot of anxiety, maybe even, depression during those difficult times. And those things, they do impact on sleep quite a lot. I mean, even if someone isn't experiencing full-blown anxiety, the mechanisms of overthinking and constantly thinking about, is there going to be more work? Am I going to be able to pay the bills? All of those things, they can keep us awake at night. They just go over and over our mind, as well as any other day-to-day stuff. I think it's very symptomatic of today's culture. We find it really hard to switch off.
yeah,
And that's one of the really big things that can impact on our sleep.
yeah. Yeah, it's true. Someone just put in a group, it's a perfect timing actually, about he's away on site, he's but working away from home, working all day and just unable to switch off. I guess he's sort of sleeping at a hotel or wherever it may be, just can't switch off fully because,
Mm.
when you're working away, it all sounds great and, you can have a pint after, whatever, but it's just not like that at all, especially depending on what age you are, especially if you're a bit older and got a family, you're doing it for work and not just to be getting away and somewhere different. And he's struggling massively to switch off. And
Mm.
one of the things is like, do I really want to be doing it anymore? And it's just, even going back to that feast or famine, it's like a survival mechanism, isn't it? That anxiety is designed to sort of keep you alert and where the
Mm.
next meal's coming from. And it's what would be a way to start off in the sense of, yes, it is busy. We are. It's very underrated as to what we go through and the pressures we're under. So I guess segmenting your kind of life would be the first step, I should imagine, to kind of not be on it kind of 24/7. Not be quoting every single night, not to be looking at jobs every single night. Perhaps getting more of a diary and plan or something like that.
Yeah. Well, I think it is tough. And, I think, I mean, these models of being able to create such a clear boundary, I think for a lot of people, they are unrealistic, especially nowadays, where it is a lot more fluid. And in the sense that when we're not actually doing a specific job, we might be doing background stuff. I think it is important to be able to switch off as much as we can. And I think what we've got to remember is that if we are not going to be doing one thing, then what are we going to be doing instead of that? And I often use the analogy about, if you dig a hole in the garden, i.e., if you take away all of the background work, you mentioned the quoting, you mentioned about, like maybe checking messages and stuff like that. If you're going to be not doing that stuff, if you're going to dig a hole in the ground, you've got to put something else in that hole to
Mm,
fill it. And hopefully you want it to be something better, if hole in the ground, put a nice flower in there or something pretty and beautiful. Because if you don't, then just over time the old soil is going to fall back in, and you'll find yourself back just doing what you've always done. And we are really bad nowadays at identifying our own stress. We tend to think that everyone is stressed, so it's okay for me to be, but really if stress is increasing, we should actually be increasing our well-being to kind of compensate and balance it.
It's like we're the only species that kind of have this stress continuously, aren't we? Like animals, if they're being chased, the stress alert of fight or flight kicks in, they run away or fight or whatever it may be, and then they kind of reset. But we don't reset, do we?
I think that's really important, because, like you say, we have that same fight or flight response, but our threats are different now. So our threats aren't about being hunted or being, running out of food. I mean, obviously for some people it can be. Our threats now are much more cognitive. Our threats are, what if I don't get any work? What if I don't make any money? What will people think of me if X, Y, or Z? Our threats are much more internal and internally generated. They still activate that threat system, though, that's deep inside our amygdala. So even though the threats are different, we still need to find ways of soothing that threat system and calming it down. And I think that is quite tough nowadays. I mean, the other thing about that as well, that fight or flight response, it's really important in sleep, because if we are worrying on a night, if we go to bed thinking or overthinking, dwelling, worrying, then that threat system's getting activated. And our brain, it's just saying, right, there's danger, and it's this idea, why would mice sleep if they thought there were cats around? They would. If we're going to bed thinking, there's danger, there's threat, there's risk. What if I don't work tomorrow? What if I don't earn enough money next week to pay the bills? To our brain, that's threat, that's danger. It doesn't make evolutionary sense to be able to sleep if we believe there's danger around the corner.
Yeah, so there's different levels of sleep, isn't there? So I guess if you're in a heightened state, you don't get to like a level of sleep which your body requires to heal and stuff. Is that right?
Absolutely. There's different stages of sleep. Some of it is for physical recovery, which is where our tissues are healing, our kind of mitochondria, our energy sources are doing stuff, and our hormones are being rebalanced and all that stuff. And then we've got stages that are more to do with our cognitive rest, which is where our memories are being consolidated, our attentional pool is getting refilled. And we need both. We need both. And if any of those get disrupted, there are some things that can disrupt us, and we can certainly talk about those. I'll be happy to talk about those with you. I mean, one of the things you mentioned at the beginning about having a pint, we know that alcohol is one of the things that disrupts REM sleep. A big part of hangover is actually lack of REM sleep. Same with like sleep medication. One important concept that I always try and get across to people is that quality of sleep is far more important than number of hours. People get so fixated on, I must get 7 hours, I must get 8 hours, I must get 9 hours. In reality, it's the quality that's more important. And we know that sleep medication, we know alcohol, we know stress, worry, depression, things like that, they impact the quality. So even though, say, alcohol, it does help us fall asleep quicker, people still often feel a bit rough the next day. I mean, we've probably all experienced that. So it's important to look more at the quality.
Yeah, a few people did actually say, I only sort of get 5 hours or whatever. So you're saying is that's not necessarily a problem if your quality of sleep is good.
Exactly, yeah. So, I mean, this 8.5 hours, which I always get asked about, this 8.5 hours, that's the pinpoint average. But the average range is between 6 and 9. And it's this little bit about the average height for man is 5'11", but not every man is 5'11", and that's okay. Right. And similarly, some people only need 6 hours sleep. Some people need 9 hours. And if you give someone who needs 6 hours sleep 9 hours, then they've overslept. They'll feel groggy,
Yeah.
right? Their sleep quality stretches out like a piece of dough. And what happens to dough when you stretch it? It starts to break, doesn't it?
Yeah.
So we need to, I mean, our optimum, we don't need to be to the minute, but we do have an optimum where for some people it'd be 7 hours, some people it'd be six. Five is, a very low amount. But if you feel fine on the amount of sleep you're getting,
Mm.
then you're getting the right amount.
Yeah. So what's I'll make it sound like painting and decorating is awful, and we've got so much on. It's like no difference, probably a lot of jobs. But what's
Mm.
some practical steps leading up to sort of going to bed? I mean, I know you've got
Yeah.
the obvious. Everybody knows about not too much stimulation in terms of what you eat and drink, like we've just discussed. Also,
Mm.
screen time. Um, but what about one? Quite a number of people, and it's a common one, get anxious like the night before, say on a Sunday night before starting on a Monday or starting a new job. They have this kind of anxiety, which of course feels, it's in their head. It feels real in their body. The anxiety. They're worried.
Mm.
They're trying to predict a future, and more often than not, the job goes smoothly. But what's some practical steps leading up to sort of bedtime?
Yeah, absolutely. It's a great question. So, like you mentioned, there's the obvious stuff. There's about, avoiding kind of, bright lights. Switch off time is important when it comes to working. So, for example, I mean, it's unrealistic to be working till 11 p.m. in a stressful job and then expect I'll get home at 11:30 and then go straight to bed and straight to sleep. We need wind down time. And normally 2, 3 hours of wind down time. We're not talking 20 minutes or 10 minutes. And ideally, that wind down time, it's a way of transitioning into sleep. So ideally, phones would be switched off. Screens aren't too bad. It depends what we're doing. So with screens, it's not so much that we're in front of a screen, it's what we're doing with that screen. So watching TV, that's okay if it's relaxing. What we don't want is people sending emails on their laptop or kind of sending text messages about work, because then they're bringing their daytime life into nighttime.
Yeah.
So we want people to be switching off from work ideally. We want people to be calming their body down. So relaxation, meditation are phenomenal for this. The brain and body work together. If our body is relaxing, our brain says, hey, it must be safe. I'll stop sending down that adrenaline. I'll stop sending that cortisol. Similarly for the brain, just doing a total, if we've got lots of stuff going through our mind, doing a total brain dump is a really nice, simple, straight exercise. Taking a sheet of paper and just for 10 minutes, literally brainstorming and brain dumping everything that comes to our mind onto that paper, just so we don't hold on to it.
Yeah.
And yeah, we can do that just before we go to bed. We can do it earlier on, but it's just really a way of getting it out of our head. There's things like having hot showers before bed is a good way of calming the body down, and again helping that transition from right, I'm not at work now,
Yeah.
getting ready for bed.
Yeah, it's like yeah, that's good to know because I chill. My wife and I, we get a slot when we've done all the kids' lives and everything else, maybe 9 till 10 to chill and watch a bit of Netflix or whatever. It's not all night because so you're not overstimulated, and then maybe read a Kindle in bed. So like you say, it's not particularly bad. Screen, it's not just about every sort of screen time. It's just like you say, I mean, I'm guilty of it running a Facebook group. So I need to change my life in many ways to have a cutoff point as to when I'm sort of interacting most. Because yeah, I do take that up to quite late. But yeah, a good point about it doesn't matter if it's like TV or reading a good book and certainly I need to get back into downloading some meditation apps. I'm trying to think of a few which I've used. It's gone now. But
Yeah,
yeah, there's plenty on there, isn't there? There's plenty of apps.
yeah. And I mean, meditation stuff, you don't have to pay for it as well. I mean, there are ones that are paid, but there's loads on YouTube, and
Yeah,
some of them are great as well.
yeah,
I think with meditation, a lot of people do say to me, "Oh, I've tried it, I didn't like it, or it didn't work for me." I do think it's about finding one you connect with.
mm,
Well, not just finding one, finding a few you connect with, because you get fed up of doing the same one, and sometimes you might prefer to do one over the other, and that's okay because the aim of it is about engagement.
yeah,
And if we've got that, we're listening to it, but we're planning what's coming next, or we're
mm,
kind of counting down, oh, right, it's at this point now, and now I know there's 5 minutes to it,
yeah,
then we're not engaged with it. We're not doing it. We're analyzing it. And again, we're activating that kind of analytical part of our brain that's not conducive to shutting down and
yeah.
relaxing and soothing.
Yeah,
Um,
and I guess like meditation is everybody when you listen, you like your brain wanders and you're like, oh, what I've got to do tomorrow and stuff like that. But it's just about trying to keep that in check a little bit and
mm,
so you're more kind of present and then not worrying ahead and planning ahead, which can cause anxiety. And like you say, yeah, there's some. I think Calm's a good app which I've used in the past. Headspace, oh, that's the one I was looking for. Um, so yeah, they are good. Um, I've got some other questions as well. So yeah, drinking. A few guys and girls said about drinking beforehand just to relax. So that's a good one which we've already covered. So it may help you drift off, but you're not getting the quality sleep you want. Um, a number of people said about kind of waking up 2 o'clock in the morning and then not being
mm.
able to switch off and just worrying about the next day and stuff. So any advice on?
Yeah. So I'm big on education. If people understand the mechanisms and what's going on, then it helps them decatastrophize it, because all of a sudden it's not this unknown thing where there's something wrong with me. It's like, oh, right, that's normal. It's how brains work. And normally when people do wake up during the night, it's normally around 2 to 3 a.m. And the reason for that is because there's a bit of a change in our body temperature, which means that we are more likely to wake. And also that second half of the night is where we're into what's called REM sleep, which is a kind of stage of sleep that occurs just before waking. So if you like, it's the stage of sleep where we're most likely to wake up
Mhm.
anyway. And most of our sleep during the second half of the night is during that. So like waking up between 2, 3, 4 o'clock, that's the most likely time for us to. And what can be really helpful with that, quite often, if we find ourselves waking up during the night, it's often paradoxically and counterintuitively a sign that we're actually going to bed a bit too early. Because a little bit like that dough analogy, if we're spending too much time in bed or too much sleep, it stretches and it gets thin. It has to break somewhere. And like dough, sleep breaks at its thinnest point, which is going to be that REM point. So even though it sounds very, very counterintuitive, if we want better quality sleep, we really want to be getting to bed later rather than earlier. Even if if we've had sleep trouble, people get into these habits of, I didn't sleep well last night, I'll go to bed earlier tonight.
Mm.
Again, like dough, you get much thicker dough, you get much more concentrated dough if you squeeze it together rather than if you stretch it out.
Mm.
So if you find yourself waking up early in the morning or throughout the night, the first thing to look at is, what time am I going to bed? It might be too early. And when I tell people that, they often say, oh, but I've always gone to bed at like 9
Mm.
o'clock, or I've always gone to bed at 10. It's like, well, you can do that if you don't have trouble with your sleep.
Yeah.
If you start having trouble with your sleep, you've got to look at, well, what are the evidence-based and science-based things that we know impact on insomnia?
Yeah, and I think that's the point, isn't it? We're all individuals, so we all, even it's just different subjects as well, but BMI and stuff like that, they all got all these guidelines, but they're just ridiculous because we're all so different. One thing I did pick up was, and something which brings me back to some of my training was like the language we use and what we tell ourselves. So,
Yeah.
I'm not a very good sleeper. I always wake up at 2 a.m. If you imagine your brain, your subconscious, like a kind of genie, you
Mm.
know, you tend to get what you ask for. And
Yeah.
you,
That's a
you know,
lovely way of putting it. That is
yeah,
such a good way of putting it.
it may sound ridiculous, but it's kind of whatever's in the forefront of your mind gets delivered. So I always use, like, if you're looking, ever look for a new car, a particular car, and you're like, I haven't seen many about, it's a red Mazda or whatever. Suddenly you see red Mazdas everywhere because
Yeah.
you've made your mind aware of what you want to sort of find. So perhaps language is important as well, what you say to yourself.
Yeah, absolutely. And those stories we tell ourselves are really important, and they become a spiral, like you described really nicely there, where if we wake up at 7 a.m. For a good sleeper, might not think anything of it. But if it's someone who's experienced insomnia for a while, it might be, oh God, I've woken up early again. God, this is awful. I've got to get it fixed. And
Mm,
what if this happens tomorrow night? I'm not sleeping well. And it becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy. Understandably, we might start doing things to try to improve these things, but quite often the things we do to improve situations can also have a knock-on effect of impacting negatively. I
yeah,
mean, certainly sleep, if you think about what a good sleeper does, they don't think about their sleep.
yeah,
They don't get to like 9 o'clock thinking, oh, I've got to go to bed now because I didn't sleep well last night. If a good sleeper has a bad night's sleep, they just write it off and it's like, I'm sure I'll sleep well tomorrow night.
yeah. It's so
Someone with
interesting, isn't
insomnia
it?
doesn't do that. They spiral, they snowball, and this story. It becomes their identity. I'm an insomniac. I don't sleep well. I always sleep badly.
Yeah.
And when it starts to become part of our identity, that's when it becomes really difficult for that person to shift.
Yeah, and it's like consciously you have to change that. So although our conscious part of our brain's a very small part, and I'm not speaking here like an expert, but you got all these subconscious programs running in the background, but we can, as human beings, consciously override it should we wish, but it's just being aware of what programs we're running. So like I say, it's just what we tell ourselves, and perhaps a good tip would be to change your language and say you are a good sleeper. Tonight I'm going to sleep well, and keep repeating it maybe.
Yeah, well, I mean, the evidence-based research says that trying to give ourselves those positive messages doesn't really work because we don't believe them. We've no evidence for them. It's a bit like a table, right? A table needs legs. And if we just swing from I don't sleep very well to I'm a great sleeper,
Mm,
our brain just says, well, where's your proof?
mm,
Prove it. What legs support that? So, what we kind of do know, though, is that a very similar thing to what you've described there, where we use more affirmations, though, that are based on reality and
mm,
based on evidence. So we see things as they are, but we don't see them as worse than they are.
mm,
So rather than I'm a bad sleeper, telling ourselves I didn't sleep well the last 2 nights, you know,
mm.
or I woke up 2 times last night rather than I'm always waking up.
Yeah, yeah, gotcha.
Kind
Yeah,
of going with the actual facts
yeah.
rather than labeling it or spiraling it. Um, because when we go with the actual facts, that can really help decatastrophize it. All of a sudden, it's not, I'm a terrible sleeper. It's, I woke up early last night.
So it's almost like I only sleep for 5 hours, but it's okay. I know I've got good
Exactly.
quality sleep. That kind of,
Yeah,
yeah,
yeah, yeah. It's like I only get 6 hours sleep. It's like the average amount of sleep is between 6 and 9 hours, and
yeah,
that's okay.
yeah.
You
Cool. Um, yeah. So we've covered a couple more. So anxious, start of a new job, all that kind of stuff. Um, So perimenopause, night sweats, insomnia. Is that a subject we can briefly talk about?
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. So, I mean, these hormonal, I mean, our body's governed by hormones and thoughts, and some of them are not within our control. obviously menopause, perimenopause is one of those things. And they used to think that perimenopause was like, very shortly before the menopause. But now the latest research shows that perimenopause can start much, much, much earlier. In fact, I know of a therapist who actually runs a service for people who have early menopause, and the youngest person she's met with that was 16, believe it or not.
Wow.
Yeah. So obviously, like symptoms of menopause. So we have the direct impact, i.e., things that directly impact on sleep. And then there's also the indirect effects. So, like sweats, body regulation difficulties, body temperature regulation difficulties, hormonal impacts. Those would be more indirect effects where we need to feel cool in order to sleep, So, even if we don't have any biological issues, if your room is too hot, it's hard to sleep. But with menopause, obviously, one of the hormonal effects is about sweats and getting too hot. So it's about how we regulate and manage those symptoms. The old classic thing about having one leg out of bed, that's so simple, and but it's so effective. Things like that can be really helpful. Things like having a cold shower before bed can be really, really helpful. If we are waking up during the night to use the toilet, making sure that we, use the toilet before going to bed, that can be really helpful. When it comes to some of these biological things, a lot of them are going to be short term. So even if we can't do anything about them, it's how do we navigate that storm just until they pass, until our body kind of regulates itself again.
Yeah, definitely. So
and I would just maybe touch on with that as well, that pain is something that people contact me with quite a lot about it, and that's massive because no
like
matter what it is,
sciatica and stuff like that, like
exactly, yeah, back problems, shoulder problems. And the thing to remember about that is that whatever we do during the day is important. And we can do all the rehab, we can do all the relaxation, all the stretching we want during the day. But often we wake up in a curled fetal position, right? A lot of the damage is getting done during the night when we're asleep. We contort into all sorts of positions, undoing all that good work we might have done during the day to help. So sleeping position is really important as well, and that's something that I work with people on. It's hard to give any kind of general advice about that because that's specific to the individual.
I got to tell a funny story on that. I mean, I know sciatica and all that problems is not funny, but I've only done it twice in my life. So I've woke up and I've been on my front, lying on my arms, and both my arms had gone numb into pins and needles, and I literally couldn't move. And when you're trying to flip yourself over, just on your body movement. And oh my God, it's just the worst feeling ever. Both arms totally numb, and you get all the pins and needles in both arms.
Yeah, and in the feet, in the legs as well.
Just the last question, because I know you're very busy and I appreciate your time. So my wife has texted in saying, "How do I stop Gary snoring?" But snoring's got to be mentioned, hasn't it?
I think so. Yeah. So snoring. So snoring's a really common problem. I mean, one thing is that it can be something that is a little bit more than snoring. There's a condition called sleep apnea, which is snoring is a symptom, but not everyone who snores has big sleep apnea problems. It's one of these things where when we snore, what happens is there's a little flap at the back of the throat, and basically that just kind of flutters. So quite often snoring is a result of mouth breathing. So there's all these things nowadays, like if you look at some of the biohacking community, they're taping their mouths shut and stuff like that. And a lot of people who I've met that have tried that, they just wake up and the tape is back on the bedside table.
Well, I'm known as a tape tart in my group because I tape up all the skirting boards and stuff. So my wife's going to be looking for my tape.
Yeah,
for sure.
You're going to be buying more tape.
But, Yeah, sorry.
Uh,
Yeah.
so yeah, I mean, what I tend to advise or suggest that we find more effective is nasal dilators, and you can pick those up on on Amazon for like £5. They come in different sizes. They do take a little bit of getting used to, but that's okay. You know, we're not used to wearing things in our nose at night, but if you persist, it basically opens up the nasal passages so that we're more inclined to breathe through our nose more than our mouth. Um, Again, sleep position is important. We're more likely to snore if we're on our back. So being able to lay on our side can be really helpful. And something that can help with that is putting a pillow between our knees when we're laid on our side. With snoring, we want to make sure, you mentioned about BMI earlier. So snoring and sleep apnea are more common with higher BMIs. So one of the best interventions, if needed, is to, lose weight if that is necessary. And making sure we don't really eat too late at night. That's another thing, because our body wants to be resting at night. We don't want to be digesting food. And if there's food in our stomach, then our body can needs more oxygen, or it redirects the blood and the oxygen in order to digest that, rather than actual restoring our tissues and all those functions we talked about a little bit earlier. So there is hope for you, Gary.
No, do you know what? Truthfully, I've had a bad cold, I've had man flu, and mine's if I drink alcohol, it's obviously worse.
Yeah.
But I would like to say I'm not too bad, but I'm never awake when I'm snoring. So, and my wife in particular is a very light sleeper as well. You move a toe and she's awake, but I guess that's another subject, but we could talk for hours and hours, and I don't want to take any more of your time, Stuart. I really appreciate you coming on. So I'm going to pop it into the group, and I'll pop in your details as well, should anybody wish to work with you or one of your team.
Yeah, absolutely.
I'm going to stop recording and I'll say a quick goodbye after, but I really appreciate you coming on.
No, it's a pleasure to speak to you, Gary. It's a privilege to speak to your group. Sounds like you're doing some really good work, and certainly I've learned something I had no idea about, the challenges that painters and decorators go through. So thank you as well.
Yeah, and it's, thanks to people like yourself coming on, we can hopefully just alleviate some pains which we have. So like I say, I really, really appreciate it.
Yeah, absolutely.
All right, you take care.
You too. Bye for now.
Yeah, bye-bye.